I never allowed my daughter to enter the study. When she got engaged to a man who started asking too many questions about my books, I installed hidden cameras throughout the house, and I had already expected this moment. My name is James, and I'm 68 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom Victorian home in the Wallingford neighborhood of Seattle, Washington, a house my late wife Margaret and I purchased 42 years ago when it was barely affordable for 2 young teachers. Margaret passed away 7 years ago after a brief but brutal fight with pancreatic cancer. She was only 59. We'd planned to have so many more years together, and her death left a hole in my life that never quite filled back in. Our daughter Emma was 22 when her mother died, fresh out of college and just starting her career as a social media content creator. People didn't quite understand that job back then. But now at 29, Emma has built a decent following of about 150,000 people on Instagram. She makes around $4,000 a month creating sponsored content for lifestyle brands, which isn't wealthy by any means, but it's honest work, and she enjoys it. I raised Emma to be independent and practical. After Margaret died, Emma got her own apartment in Capitol Hill, paid her own bills, and built her own life. I was proud of that. She'd visit every Sunday for dinner, and we'd talk about her work, her friends, her life. She dated casually over the years, nothing serious. She seemed content, focused on building her career and enjoying her 20s. Then she met Marcus. It was at a networking event for content creators and entrepreneurs. Marcus was there representing himself as a tech startup founder, and Emma was immediately taken with him. He was 32, handsome in that polished way that comes from expensive haircuts and gym memberships. And he had a confidence that Emma found attractive. Within 3 weeks, they were dating exclusively. Within 2 months, Emma was convinced he was different from anyone she'd dated before. I met Marcus for the first time at a Sunday dinner at my house. He arrived wearing a suit that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent, and he carried himself like someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. He was polite, charming even, with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. But something about him felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced being likable rather than actually being likable. During dinner, he asked questions. Not about Emma, about me. About my career, my retirement, my property. When I mentioned I'd been a professor of English literature at the University of Washington for 36 years, his eyes lit up with what I initially thought was genuine interest. English literature, he said. That's fascinating. I bet you have quite the book collection. I kept my answer vague. A few shelves worth. Occupational hazard. He pressed. First editions? Signed copies? Those can be worth quite a bit, from what I understand. Emma laughed. Dad's books are just books, Marcus. He's not running a rare bookstore. I smiled and changed the subject, but I'd noticed the calculation in his eyes, the way he'd glanced around my home, assessing, measuring, the way he'd asked pointed questions about whether the house was paid off, whether I planned to downsize now that I was living alone. After dinner, as Emma helped me clean up and Marcus excused himself to take a phone call, she mentioned that he was doing really well with his startup. He'd just secured venture capital funding, she said. He was on track to be very successful. I asked what the startup did. Emma hesitated. It's kind of technical, something with blockchain and sustainable energy. I don't totally understand it, but Marcus is really passionate about it. That was the first red flag. Not that she didn't understand his business, but that after 2 months of dating, he apparently hadn't bothered to explain it in a way she could. Marcus noticed the door to my study during that first visit. It was off the living room, always kept locked. He asked about it casually, and I gave him the same answer I'd always given Emma since she was a child. That's my private workspace. I keep it organized my own way. I prefer people don't go in there. Emma had respected that boundary her entire life. She'd grown up knowing the study was Dad's space, and she'd never questioned it. Marcus, however, looked at that locked door like it was a puzzle he needed to solve. Over the next few months, I watched their relationship develop with growing unease. Emma was happy, or at least she seemed happy, but there were small things that bothered me. Marcus would make comments about her apartment being small or her car being old. He'd talk about the lifestyle they'd have together once his startup took off, about the house they'd buy, the vacations they'd take. Emma would smile, but I could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she'd changed the subject. I did what any concerned parent would do. I hired a private investigator. His name was Raymond Chen, a former Seattle PD detective who'd gone private 5 years earlier. I gave him Marcus's full name, Marcus Ashton Caldwell, and asked him to do a background check. The report came back 2.5 weeks later, and it was worse than I'd feared. Marcus was not, in fact, running a successful tech startup. The venture capital funding didn't exist. What did exist was a pattern. Marcus had been engaged twice before, both times to women with successful careers or family money. The first was a 34-year-old dentist in Portland. Marcus had convinced her to add him to her medical practice's business account for administrative purposes, then systematically drained $42,000 before she discovered it. She'd pressed charges, but he'd paid restitution and avoided jail time. The second was a real estate agent in Vancouver, British Columbia. He'd gotten her to co-sign on a luxury car lease and a high-end apartment, then abandoned her with the debt when he moved back to the States. She'd filed a lawsuit, but he'd declared bankruptcy and she'd never recovered the money. Emma, Raymond's report suggested, was Marcus's third target, but Emma herself wasn't wealthy. Raymond's assessment was that Marcus was betting on me, on whatever inheritance Emma might eventually receive. The questions about my books, my house, my finances, they all made sense now. I didn't tell Emma about the investigation immediately. I knew she wouldn't believe me. She was in love, or what she thought was love, and any criticism would only push her away. I'd seen it happen to other parents. The more they pushed against an unsuitable partner, the harder their children clung to them. So I waited, and I watched, and I prepared. 6 months into their relationship, Emma called me with news. They were getting engaged. Marcus had proposed at a rooftop restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, very public, very Instagram-worthy. Emma was crying happy tears on the phone, and I congratulated her, told her I was thrilled for her, told her all the things a father is supposed to say. What else could I do? The engagement party was held at a trendy venue in South Lake Union. Marcus had chosen it. The cost was $15,000, split between both families, though Marcus's contribution came almost entirely from a credit card, according to my discreet inquiries. His parents, I learned, lived in Tucson and were not wealthy. His father was a retired postal worker, his mother a substitute teacher. They were good people by all accounts, baffled by their son's expensive lifestyle and apparent success. At the engagement party, I met some of Marcus's friends. They were a specific type, the kind of people who talked constantly about investments and opportunities and disruption. When I mentioned I was a retired English professor, one of them actually said, "Oh, so not really a business background then?" I smiled. "No, not really. Marcus introduced me to people as Emma's father. He has quite the book collection." Each time he said it, I noticed the slight emphasis, like he was testing how people reacted, gauging interest. The wedding planning that followed was a nightmare. Marcus wanted everything lavish. A venue at a boutique winery in Woodinville that cost $65,000. A photographer package for $28,000. A dress from a designer boutique that cost $18,000. The total budget climbed toward $200,000. Emma was stressed. I could see it every time we talked. She'd taken out a small loan. She was doing extra sponsored posts, working weekends, barely sleeping. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed energized by the planning, always talking about how their wedding would be the event of the season, how it would be perfect for their brand. I contributed $25,000 toward the wedding. It hurt to do it, knowing where the money was really going, but I couldn't watch my daughter destroy herself financially. Marcus thanked me politely, then immediately started discussing the honeymoon. He wanted the Maldives, another $30,000 Emma didn't have. During this time, Marcus started visiting my house more frequently. He'd come with Emma for Sunday dinners, but he'd arrive early or stay late, always finding reasons to linger. He'd ask about the house. When had I bought it? What was it worth now? Had I considered selling and moving into something more manageable? One Sunday afternoon, Emma had to leave early for a work call with a brand sponsor. Marcus offered to stay and help me clean up. I agreed, curious what he was planning. After Emma left, he made his move. He was subtle about it, more subtle than Vanessa had been in my source material, but the intent was the same. "James," he said, loading the dishwasher with studied casualness. "Emma and I have been talking about our future. We're thinking about buying a house after the wedding. Something in Queen Anne or Magnolia, with good light for her content creation and space for my home office. But the housing market in Seattle is insane right now." I nodded, wiping down the counters. "We were wondering," he continued, "have you thought about downsizing? This house is pretty big for one person. You could sell it, move into a condo downtown, something modern with less maintenance, and maybe help us with a down payment. Think of it as an early inheritance. You'd be setting Emma up for success." I turned to face him, taking my time, drying my hands. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus, but I'm quite comfortable here. Margaret and I built our life in this house. I'm not ready to leave." His smile tightened slightly. "Of course, I understand. I just thought, family helps family, right? And Emma's really struggling with all these wedding costs." "Emma's an adult," I said calmly. "She makes her own choices. If the wedding's too expensive, you two can always scale back. Maybe something simpler, more intimate." His eyes flashed with something cold for just a second before the charming mask slipped back on. "Scale back? This is the most important day of our lives, James. This is Emma's dream wedding. Don't you want your daughter to be happy?" "I want my daughter to be financially secure," I replied. "There's a difference." He left shortly after, and I could tell I'd become a problem for him. The friendly future son-in-law act had cracked just enough for me to see what was underneath. The next day, Emma called me. She was upset. Marcus had told her I'd been dismissive of their wedding plans, that I'd suggested they have a cheap ceremony. I explained what had actually been said, but Emma was caught between us now, torn between her father and her fiancé. We had a tense conversation that ended with both of us frustrated. That's when things started to escalate. Marcus began asking Emma more pointed questions about my background. Had I inherited money? Did I have investments? What about life insurance? Emma, uncomfortable with the interrogation, mentioned it to me during one of our Sunday dinners when Marcus wasn't there. "He keeps asking about your finances, Dad. I don't know why it matters so much to him." "Maybe he's worried about your future security," I said, though we both knew that wasn't it. Then Marcus started researching. I know this because Emma's friend Stephanie, who was more perceptive than Emma gave her credit for, mentioned seeing Marcus at the Seattle Public Library downtown, going through old University of Washington faculty directories and academic journals. He was looking for information about me, about my career, about anything that might hint at hidden wealth. What Marcus didn't know was what was actually in my study. For 43 years, since I was 25 years old and just starting my doctoral program, I'd been collecting rare books. Not just any books. First editions, signed copies, manuscripts, letters, the kind of literary treasures that most people don't even know exist. I had a first edition of The Great Gatsby signed by F. Scott Fitzgerald himself, purchased at an estate sale in 1985 for $3,000, now worth approximately $400,000. I had a first edition of For Whom the Bell Tolls, signed by Hemingway, a first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, signed by Harper Lee, a first edition of The Catcher in the Rye, in near-mint condition, a complete set of first edition Faulkner novels, several of them signed, and dozens of other treasures accumulated over 4 decades of careful collecting. My most prized possession was a handwritten letter from Edgar Allan Poe to his wife Virginia, dated 1842, which I'd purchased at auction in 1994 for $95,000. It was now valued at $600,000. In total, my collection was worth approximately $2.7 million. Margaret had known about the collection, of course. She'd helped me research values, find auction houses, plan purchases. After she died, the collection became even more important to me. These books weren't just investments. They were my passion, my life's work, the physical manifestation of everything I'd studied and taught for nearly 4 decades. Emma knew I collected books, but she thought it was just a hobby. She'd seen me buy books at estate sales and antiquarian bookshops, but she had no idea of their value. I'd planned to tell her eventually, when she was older, more settled, more prepared to understand the responsibility that came with such wealth. Marcus's arrival had changed my timeline. 3 months before the wedding, I made a decision. I installed security cameras throughout my house, not just in the study, but in every common area. Motion activated, infrared, recording to a cloud server, accessible from my phone. I also upgraded the lock on my study door to a smart lock with a 6-digit code that only I knew. Emma noticed the cameras when she visited 2 weeks later. "New security system, Dad?" "There have been some break-ins in the neighborhood," I said. It was partially true. There'd been one break-in 4 blocks away. Just being cautious. Marcus noticed too. I saw him looking at the cameras, calculating angles, assessing coverage. He asked if they recorded continuously or just when triggered. I told him continuously, though actually they were motion activated. I wanted him to think he was being watched more than he was. The wedding approached. Emma looked exhausted every time I saw her. She'd lost weight, had dark circles under her eyes. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed energized, constantly posting on social media about their journey to forever, tagging luxury brands, building an audience for their wedding content. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, Marcus brought someone to Sunday dinner. His name was Trevor, supposedly an old friend from college. Trevor asked a lot of questions about my career, about my book collection, about what kinds of books I had. He mentioned he'd done some work in rare book appraisal and would love to take a look at my collection sometime. I declined politely. But I knew what Trevor really was, an appraiser. Marcus was trying to figure out what I had through a proxy. After they left, I reviewed the camera footage from dinner. At one point, while Emma and I were in the kitchen, Marcus had walked Trevor to my study door. They'd examined the lock, and Trevor had taken photos of it with his phone. They were planning something. I called Raymond Chen again. I asked him to do a deeper dive on Marcus, specifically to look for any connections to theft, fraud, or property crimes. The report came back 4 days later. Marcus had an arrest record I hadn't known about. 10 years ago, when he was 22, he'd been arrested for breaking and entering at his ex-girlfriend's apartment. He'd claimed he was just retrieving his belongings, and the charges had been dropped, but it was there in the record. I now had proof of intent and a pattern of behavior. I also had cameras recording everything. All I needed was for Marcus to make his move. The alert came at 3:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, 12 days before the wedding. Motion detected. Study door. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed. Marcus was there. He was wearing dark clothes and gloves. He was trying codes on the keypad, systematic, starting with obvious combinations. Birthdays, addresses, years. I watched him for 8 minutes. He tried 47 different combinations. He didn't get in. The lock held. Eventually, he gave up, looked around nervously, and left. I had it all on video. Crystal clear. Infrared footage showing his face, his actions, the timestamp. But I didn't confront him that night. I waited. The next morning, I called Emma. "Can you come over today? It's important. Come alone." She arrived that afternoon, worried. "Dad, what's wrong? You sounded serious." I pulled up the video on my tablet. "I need you to watch something." Emma's face went through a progression of emotions as she watched. Confusion first, then disbelief, then anger, then hurt. When the video ended, she sat silent for a long moment. "Why would he?" she started, then stopped. "What's in the study, Dad?" I took a deep breath. It was time. Come with me. We walked to the study. I entered the code, disengaged the smart lock, and opened the door for the first time in Emma's presence since she was a small child. The study was not large, maybe 12 by 14 feet, but every wall was lined floor to ceiling with custom-built, climate-controlled shelving. The books were arranged by era and author, each one protected in archival quality sleeves. Soft LED lighting illuminated the spines. Emma gasped. I showed her the Fitzgerald First Edition, the green cloth binding with gold lettering, Fitzgerald's signature on the title page in fading ink. I showed her the Hemingway, the Poe letter in its protective case, the Mockingbird, the Faulkner collection. I explained what each was worth, how I'd acquired it, why it mattered. "Dad," she whispered, touching the sleeve, protecting the Gatsby with trembling fingers. How much is all of this worth?" "About $2.7 million, give or take, depending on the market. Some pieces are harder to value. The Poe letter, for instance, is essentially priceless because of its rarity." Emma sat down in my reading chair, the leather wingback where I spent my evenings. $2.7 million. And you never told me. I was waiting for the right time. I wanted you to be older, more settled. I didn't want the knowledge of this wealth to change you, to make you a target. Margaret and I agreed when you were young that we'd tell you eventually. But after she died, I became even more protective. Maybe too protective. Does anyone else know? My lawyer knows. My insurance company knows. That's it. I kept it secret because I didn't want you to become what Marcus was looking for. Someone with access to family money. Emma looked at the video on my phone again. Her fiancé trying to break into this room. He was looking for this. He suspected I had something valuable. He's been researching me, bringing appraisers here, asking questions. The expensive wedding, the pressure to sell the house. It was all about accessing what he thought was here. Emma was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "I've been so stupid. You've been in love. Or what you thought was love. But love doesn't do this, Emma. Love doesn't try to break into your father's private space at 3 a.m. Love doesn't push you into debt for a wedding you can't afford. Love doesn't calculate and scheme." Emma pulled out her phone. She stared at it for a moment, then made the call. I stepped out of the study to give her privacy. Through the door, I could hear her voice, calm at first, then rising in anger. The conversation lasted 23 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were red, but her expression was determined. He denied it at first. Then when I told him I'd seen the video, he got angry. He said I was too influenced by you, that I was choosing you over him. He said I'd never amount to anything with my little internet job. He actually said that, she laughed bitterly. 2 years. I wasted 2 years on someone who just saw me as a payday. I pulled her into a hug. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know this hurts. He never loved me at all, did he? I don't think he knows how to love anyone except himself." Over the next few days, Emma handled the aftermath. The wedding was canceled. They lost some deposits, but it was a fraction of what the full wedding would have cost. Marcus moved out of Emma's apartment. He'd apparently had a key made without asking, and had been slowly moving his things in. Emma changed her locks. His true colors emerged fully in the following week. He posted on social media about being betrayed by someone from a wealthy family who kept secrets. He tried to spin it like Emma and I had deceived him. Some of his followers bought it, but Emma's friends knew the truth, and the narrative didn't last long. The worst moment came when Marcus showed up at my house 4 days after the breakup. Emma wasn't there. He rang the doorbell at 7:30 on a Saturday morning. "I know what you have," he said through the door. "Emma told me about the books. You owe me. I spent 2 years on her. I invested in that relationship. I called the police. They arrived within 10 minutes and escorted him away with a warning about trespassing. I haven't seen him since, though Emma told me he moved back to Portland about 3 weeks later." Emma spent the next month recovering. She threw herself into her work, reconnected with friends she'd neglected during the relationship, and came over for Sunday dinners every single week. She was hurt, but she was healing. 6 weeks after the canceled wedding, something unexpected happened. Emma had been invited to tour the Seattle Art Museum's new literary exhibition, a collection of famous authors' manuscripts and letters on loan from various collections. She asked if I wanted to come with her. At the exhibition, we met the curator, a man named David Chen, 31 years old, originally from Vancouver. He was a rare book specialist with a master's degree in archival sciences, and he clearly loved his work. When he learned I was a retired English professor with an interest in rare books, he engaged me in a genuine conversation about literary preservation. the ethics of private collecting versus public access, and the joy of connecting people with literature. Emma and David talked for nearly an hour after the tour ended. He asked about her work, seemed genuinely interested in the creative aspects of content creation, and never once asked about finances or family money. When he learned she was recovering from a difficult breakup, he was sympathetic without being pushy. He asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime. She said yes. That was 3 months ago. Emma and David have been dating since then, taking it slow, building something real. He knows about my book collection now, Emma told him after 6 weeks of dating, when she felt confident in his character. His reaction was perfect. He was amazed by the collection, asked intelligent questions about preservation and acquisition, but he wasn't interested in the monetary value. He saw what I saw, 43 years of passion and dedication to literature. Last Sunday, David and Emma came over for dinner. Afterward, we went to the study together. David examined the books with the care and reverence of someone who understood what they represented. "These are extraordinary, Professor," he said, carefully viewing the Poe letter through its protective case. "But you know what's more extraordinary? That you built a career teaching students to love literature while building this collection. That you passed that love of books to your daughter. That's a legacy that goes beyond monetary value." Emma squeezed his hand and smiled at me. I realized in that moment that the real legacy was never the books. It was the values I'd passed down. The importance of character, of patience, of choosing people for who they are, rather than what they have. The books will go to Emma someday. Maybe she'll keep them. Maybe she'll donate some to a museum. Maybe she'll sell a few to fund her future. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she learned the lessons she needed to learn. She learned to recognize manipulation. She learned that her worth isn't determined by someone else's opinion of her career or her prospects. She learned that real love looks like David, asking thoughtful questions and respecting boundaries, not like Marcus, calculating and scheming. I never allowed my daughter to enter the study because I was trying to protect her from the burden of wealth, from becoming a target. Looking back, maybe I should have trusted her with the truth earlier. Maybe the secrecy made her vulnerable because she never learned to recognize people who saw her as a means to an end. But you do your best as a parent, make mistakes, and hope your children forgive you and grow from the experience. Emma forgave me. More than that, she understood. And together, we built something better than what I'd planned. Not just an inheritance of wealth, but an inheritance of wisdom. The study is no longer a secret between us. The cameras are still there. I kept those. But now Emma knows the code. She comes and goes as she pleases, often bringing David to sit among the books and talk about literature and life and their future together. They're planning a small wedding for next spring. The budget is $12,000, and they're paying for it themselves. They don't want my money. They want my blessing. They have it completely. Sometimes on Sunday evenings, the three of us sit in the study, drinking tea and talking about books. The Fitzgerald gleams under the soft lighting. The Poe letter rests in its protective case. The Hemingway first edition, which David is helping me prepare for a museum loan, sits carefully wrapped on my desk. These books are worth millions. But sitting here with my daughter and the man who truly loves her, surrounded by the work of my lifetime, I realize the real treasure was never on these shelves. It was in raising a daughter who could learn from her mistakes, who could recognize real love when she found it, who could appreciate legacy without being corrupted by it, who could understand that protecting someone isn't the same as preparing them. Marcus tried to steal from us. He tried to manipulate, to deceive, to take what we'd built over decades. But in the end, he gave us something instead. He gave Emma clarity. He gave us a second chance to communicate honestly. He gave me the opportunity to teach the lessons I should have taught years ago. I installed cameras and upgraded locks to protect $2.7 million in rare books. But what I was really protecting was something far more valuable: the relationship between a father and daughter, the integrity of family, the chance to build something real based on trust and honesty. The study door is still locked at night. The cameras still record. But now there are 2 people who know the code, soon to be 3, when David officially becomes part of the family. Father, daughter, and someone who sees her, for who she truly is. That's the story of how I almost lost my daughter to someone who saw her as a means to an end, and how a collection of rare books saved our relationship. Not because of their value, but because they forced us to have the conversations we should have had years ago. Because they revealed Marcus's true nature before it was too late. Because they taught Emma that her worth isn't measured in dollars or followers or someone else's ambitions. I never allowed my daughter to enter the study, until I did, and everything changed for the better.